All right, let's jump right in. Today's deep dive takes us to the heart of Army Offensive Doctrine, ADP 390, Chapter 3, the Offense.
We're talking about how to take the fight to the enemy and win decisively.
But this isn't just about memorizing attack formations or anything. We're going deep on how the Army thinks about achieving decisive victory on the offense.
You got it. This chapter really lays that groundwork for understanding what the Army means when it talks about offensive mindset, taking the initiative, dictating the terms of battle, and ultimately achieving victory.
And this applies across the board, right? I mean, it's not just for huge battles. It goes down to smaller engagements too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Large-scale combat operations, smaller engagements, the core principles, they all come back to the same thing, imposing your will on the enemy.
The chapter keeps mentioning the purposes of the offense. It seems like they're saying it's not just about attacking for the sake of attacking, right? There's got to be a bigger strategy in play.
Exactly. Anyone can attack, but the art is understanding how, when, and why to attack. The offense is about achieving decisive victory, forcing the enemy to react to your moves, not the other way around. It's about seizing the initiative and never giving it back.
So it's as much about strategy and mindset as it is about tactics on the ground.
You got it. And this chapter lays out some pretty critical concepts, starting with the 4 key characteristics of a successful offense: audacity, concentration, surprise, and tempo.
And I bet those look different on a modern battlefield than they did even a few decades ago. I mean, how do you achieve surprise in an age of drones and satellite imagery? Seems like the enemy would always see you coming.
That's a great point, and it highlights how these principles have evolved. Take surprise, for example. You're right, gone are the days of completely catching the enemy off guard. Today, it's less about shock and awe and more about, I guess you could say, outsmart and outmaneuver.
How do you do that?
Think deception, unconventional tactics, even using the enemy's expectations against them. Commanders have to get creative to make those opportunities.
So you're saying surprise is still achievable, it's just it takes more finesse, more cunning.
Yeah.
It's about exploiting those tiny windows of opportunity that open and close in an instant.
Exactly. And that's where the other characteristics come in: audacity to act decisively when those windows appear, concentration to bring overwhelming force to bear at that critical point, and tempo to keep the enemy reeling, unable to exploit your vulnerabilities.
Speaking of audacity, didn't Patton say something like, never take counsel of your fears? It seems like a little healthy disregard for the odds has its place in a successful offense.
He did. And he also said, boldness is often the shortest, surest path to your objective, even if it is a little rough going. Look at Operation Desert Storm, the 7th and 8th Corps turning movement. Swinging around into the flank and rear of the Iraqi Republican Guard, that was audacity on a grand scale.
Textbook flanking maneuver.
Yeah.
Completely shifted the momentum of the war. But that takes us back to your point about surprise. That kind of maneuver only works if you can mask your intentions and capabilities long enough to get into position.
Absolutely, and that's where information dominance is key. Today, concentration, that focused application of combat power, is about knowing where to hit the enemy just as much as it is about raw firepower.
It's like that old boxing adage, it's the punch you don't see coming that knocks you out.
Exactly. And then there's tempo. Think of it like a boxer's combination, a series of punches, each one building on the lag, keeping the opponent off balance, unable to mount a defense. Maintaining that tempo, that relentless speed and rhythm of operations can be just as decisive as any single attack.
So you literally never give them a chance to breathe, much less counterattack. Okay, so we've got these 4 pillars of a successful offense: audacity, concentration, surprise, and tempo. But how do those actually translate into action on the ground? What are we talking about here when we talk about putting those principles into practice?
That's where the 4 types of offensive operations come in: movement to contact, attack, exploitation, and pursuit.
Let's start with movement to contact. Paint a picture for me. What does that actually look like?
Okay, so picture this. You're entering a fluid situation. Maybe the enemy's location isn't totally clear. Movement to contact is about feeling out the enemy, developing the situation, and establishing that initial contact. It's like a reconnaissance in force, but you're prepared to transition to a more forceful engagement if necessary.
So once you make contact, you've got some decisions to make. Do you escalate, disengage? What are your options at that point?
Exactly. You can attack, defend, bypass, delay, or even withdraw. It all comes down to that on-the-ground assessment and the commander's intent.
Got it. So that's movement to contact. feeling things out, getting eyes on the enemy. Now let's talk about the classic attack. What are we talking about here when we say attack?
The attack is, well, it's more straightforward. You have at least some understanding of the enemy's disposition, and you're going in with the intent to destroy or defeat them, seize terrain, or both. It's coordinated, it's decisive, and it has a clear objective.
And attacks could be hasty or deliberate, right?
Yeah.
What's the difference there?
A hasty attack is all about speed. You're acting on a fleeting opportunity and don't have the luxury of time for extensive planning. It might be seizing a bridge or exploiting a gap in enemy lines. A deliberate attack, on the other hand, is carefully planned and coordinated, often with more assets involved.
Okay, so you've made contact, maybe even launched a successful attack. What happens next? You're not just going to pack up and go home, right?
Ideally, you exploit your advantage, and that's where exploitation comes in. It's about pressing your advantage after a successful attack, disrupting the enemy in depth, and preventing them from regaining their footing. It's like that old saying, kick them while they're down.
And I can see how that would be critical to maintaining momentum, keeping the enemy off balance, not letting them regroup or reinforce.
It absolutely is. And finally, you have the pursuit, the final nail in the coffin. This is when the enemy is already on the run, and you're chasing them down to completely eliminate the threat. Think of the Third Army's drive through France in 1944, a textbook example of a successful pursuit. They kept the pressure on, didn't let the German forces regroup, and liberated huge swaths of territory.
Okay, that makes sense. We've covered the 4 types of offensive operations movement to contact, attack, exploitation, and pursuit. But before we go deeper into the planning considerations, let's talk about control measures, the language of the offense.
Absolutely. You can't conduct a successful offensive operation, especially at scale, without everyone being on the same page. Control measures, these are the common language we use to synchronize our actions and achieve a shared understanding of the battle space.
Because it's like, we need a shared battle map in our minds so everyone knows what they're doing, where they need to be, especially when things get chaotic.
Exactly. And some of these terms might seem basic, but their importance can't be overstated. For example, the assault position. This is where a unit makes final preparations for the assault. But it has to be more than just a random spot on the map, right?
Right. You don't want to be caught out in the open right before the big push. You need a good concealed position that offers cover and concealment, but also allows you to observe the objective and maneuver as needed.
Exactly. And that takes us to assault time, the precise moment the attack on the initial objective kicks off. This ensures synchronized action, so you don't have units attacking piecemeal.
You want that coordinated, overwhelming force hitting at the right time. Now, what about attack by fire position? What's going on there?
Think of it like this. You're the main effort, maneuvering towards the objective. But you've got another unit providing direct fire support from a covered position, suppressing the enemy so you can maneuver more effectively.
They're not necessarily the ones storming the objective, but they're paving the way with their firepower. Okay, so the attack position, that's the last covered position before crossing the line of departure, right?
Right. Think of the attack position as that final staging area where you make last-minute checks, adjust your formation, and get ready to cross that line.
The line of departure, that sounds like a big one. What exactly does that mean?
It is. Think of it as the starting line for the attack, where units transition from movement to maneuver. It's crucial for coordinating the advance of the entire force.
Got it. So you're lined up on the line of departure, ready to go.
Yeah.
What else do you need to know?
Well, first and foremost, where are you going? You need to know your objective. And that might sound obvious, but in military terms, an objective is more than just a place on a map.
It's not just about getting from point A to point B.
Right. The objective is the focal point of the operation, the ultimate goal. It could be a piece of key terrain like that hilltop controlling the valley, or an enemy force that needs to be neutralized. And commanders will often assign intermediate objectives as well, breaking down a larger objective into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Makes sense. You're eating the elephant one bite at a time. Okay, what about the axis of advance?
The axis of advance is like a general corridor or route that the bulk of your combat power will move through. It's not a rigid line they have to stay on, but more of a general direction for their movement.
So it's like a highway, but with more enemy contact and flanking maneuvers.
Exactly. And then there's bypass criteria, which is especially important in a fast-paced offensive. This tells commanders which enemy units or positions they can afford to ignore or bypass to maintain momentum.
So you're not getting bogged down in unnecessary firefights,
Yeah.
right? You're focused on the ultimate objective. Okay, that's the axis of advance and bypass criteria.
Mm-hmm.
What about the battle handover line?
This is a critical one, especially when you've got multiple units operating in close proximity. Imagine two units, one advancing, one stationary. The battle handover line is where responsibility for that piece of ground transitions from one unit to the other. It ensures a smooth handover and prevents any gaps in the line that the enemy could exploit.
Like a baton pass in a relay race, but with more explosions and a lot more at stake. Okay, that's the battle handover line. What about the direction of attack?
This is even more specific than the axis of advance. It's the exact route a unit is directed to take, often to maintain control in low visibility situations like night attacks or when you're moving through obscurance.
So it's the difference between saying head north and follow this specific path to the target.
Got it. Now, you mentioned the final coordination line earlier, but you said it isn't technically an FSCM.
That's right. It's a coordination measure, but not technically a control measure.
Okay, so what's so important about this line if it isn't an FSCM? The final coordination line is critical for synchronizing your maneuver elements with your supporting fires, especially as you get close to the objective.
So you're making sure all your firepower is properly aligned and coordinated right before the assault begins.
Right. Now, remember the FLOT, the forward line of own troops?
I do.
Well, that's another important one for maintaining awareness on the battlefield. It designates the most forward positions of friendly forces, giving everyone a clear picture of where their buddies are.
Okay, makes sense. What about the limit of advance? I'm guessing this one does what it sounds like.
It does. It's a line set beyond the objective to prevent units from getting overextended and potentially isolated. It's about knowing how far to go, even when you have the momentum.
Okay, so we've got our limit of advance. What about the line of contact?
This one's pretty simple. It's the general trace where friendly and enemy forces are engaged, basically, where fighting is happening. It's constantly shifting and changing throughout the battle as units advance and make contact.
Got it. So what about the objective rally point? That sounds like a good place to know about, especially if things get messy.
Exactly. It's a pre-planned location near the objective where units can regroup, reorganize, and prepare for the assault if they get separated during the approach, which, let's be honest, can easily happen in the chaos of an attack.
That makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be running around like a lost puppy if you get separated from your unit. You need a designated rallying point.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about rally points, let's talk about the support by fire position. This is where a unit positions itself to provide dedicated direct fire support to another unit that's assaulting the objective.
So they're like a designated fire support element, providing cover for their buddies as they maneuver.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about target control measures? I imagine those get pretty important when you've got multiple units engaging targets and you don't want to be shooting at your own guys.
You got it. Target control measures are how we make sure we're all shooting at the right things at the right times. They give us a common language for talking about targets, whether that's a point target like a bunker, a linear target like a trench line, or a whole area target.
So it's all about coordination and deconfliction.
Right. And that brings us to the time of attack, which is simply the moment when the main effort crosses the line of departure, or, in a limited visibility attack, the point of departure, basically the moment the attack kicks off.
Makes sense. Now this next one, the probable line of deployment. It sounds interesting. What exactly is that?
Imagine a unit is approaching the line of departure, but they're not in their ideal assault formation. The probable line of deployment is where they'll adjust their formation before crossing the LD so they can hit the enemy with a coordinated attack.
It's like a final staging area for the assault, making sure everyone is organized and ready to go.
Precisely. Now, let's say things get really hairy during the attack, and a unit gets dispersed. That's where a rally point comes in. It's a pre-designated spot where everyone knows to converge to regroup, reassess, and get back in the fight.
You can't go wrong with a good rally point.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a lot of control measures to keep track of, but I'm already starting to see how they all fit together to create a coordinated and synchronized attack.
They do. And understanding these terms is just the first step. The real art of the offense lies in understanding how to apply these concepts in a dynamic and ever-changing battle space.
Which is a perfect segue to the next part of our deep dive. We've got the vocabulary down, but what about the big picture thinking that goes into planning a successful offensive operation? What are some of the key considerations commanders have to think about before they even issue those first orders?
That's where things get really interesting. You're right, planning an offensive operation. Well, it's kind of like conducting an orchestra. Except, the instruments shoot back, Commanders have to consider terrain, enemy disposition, their own troops' capabilities, all before the first shot is even fired.
So many moving pieces. Where do they even begin? What are the top priorities when it comes to planning an offensive like this?
Command and control, that's paramount. You need crystal clear communication channels, shared understanding of the commander's intent, and that's even more critical in the fluid, unpredictable environment of an offense.
No time for misunderstandings when you're in the heat of battle.
Exactly, and inevitably, those communication channels will get disrupted.
So what happens then?
That's where battle-tested backup plans come in. Well-trained troops, a healthy dose of initiative from subordinates.
Got it. So you're saying clear communication is essential, but so is the ability to adapt when those comms inevitably go down. Empower those junior leaders to make decisions on the fly.
Absolutely. Now let's talk movement and maneuver. It's not just about getting troops from point A to point B. It's about doing it in a way that disrupts the enemy, exploits their weaknesses, keeps them constantly reacting to your actions.
You want to dictate the tempo. Keep them guessing.
Precisely. Think of it like a boxer using footwork and feints to create an opening. A good offensive, it should feel like that. A series of jabs, maneuvers, keeping the enemy off balance until that knockout punch presents itself.
Okay, I like that analogy. It's not just brute force. It's about using maneuver to gain a tactical advantage.
Right, and that's where assured mobility, and counter-mobility, those become critical.
Okay, I'll admit I need a little refresher on those. Let's start with assured mobility. What are we talking about there?
In the simplest terms, it's ensuring your forces can move freely around the battlefield, overcoming any obstacles in their way. This could involve breaching enemy defenses, clearing minefields, rapidly deploying bridging assets, whatever it takes to keep the offensive rolling.
That's where all those amazing engineering assets come into play.
Exactly. But it's not just about getting your forces across the battlefield. It's about disrupting the enemy's ability to do the same. And that's where counter-mobility comes in.
So what does that look like? How do you counter the enemy's mobility?
Think minefields, obstacles, demolitions, anything that slows their movement, disrupts their ability to react effectively to your offensive.
It's like that old saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. By slowing the enemy down, you can dictate the pace of the battle and create those windows of opportunity for your own forces.
That's a great way to put it. Now, we can't talk offensive planning without addressing the critical role of intelligence and fires.
Targeting, it's huge, right?
Absolutely. You need to know where the enemy is, what they're capable of, and how best to target them with your own firepower.
Because firepower without intelligence is like swinging blindfolded, right? You might hit something, but it's probably not what you want.
Exactly. Every round fired, it should have a purpose and effect on the enemy. Today's battlefield, it requires precision, a deep understanding of the enemy's dispositions, capabilities, their likely courses of action.
It's not just about how many guns you have. It's about using them effectively to support your maneuver forces. Speaking of support, we got to talk about sustainment.
Logistics. The unsung heroes of any successful military operation, especially a fast-paced offensive.
Because even the best offensive plan will fall apart without beans, bullets, and bandages.
Exactly. And ADP 390, it really emphasizes this. Logistics, they can't be an afterthought. It's not just about delivering supplies. It's about anticipating needs, managing consumption rates, and ensuring that the right support gets to the right place at the right time.
It's like running a giant, incredibly complex, very dangerous supply chain.
That's a great analogy. And just like any supply chain efficiency, it's key. We're seeing a lot of technological advancements aimed at improving logistics, autonomous vehicles, drones for resupply missions, even 3D printing to create spare parts in the field.
So the Army's taking a page from Amazon's playbook.
In a way, yes. It's about reducing that logistical footprint, minimizing the risk to soldiers, and ensuring they have what they need to fight and win.
And we can't talk logistics without mentioning medical support. Those golden hour procedures. Those can be the difference between life and death on the battlefield.
Absolutely. ADP 390 is very clear. You need a robust and responsive medical system. Evacuate and treat wounded soldiers quickly, even in the most challenging environments.
And the Army's got some amazing capabilities these days. Forward surgical teams, aeromedical evacuation, advanced trauma care. It's really incredible how far military medicine has come.
It really is. It's a testament to the Army's commitment to taking care of its people, because at the end of the day, our soldiers, they're our most valuable asset.
Well said. Now, shifting gears a bit, the chapter also covers some pretty intense realities of the modern battlefield. Fighting in a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear CBRN environment. That's a whole other level of complexity.
It is. A CBRN environment, it adds a whole new layer of challenges to an already complex operational environment.
So how does the Army's offensive doctrine address that very real threat of a CBRN attack, especially when speed and momentum are so critical in an offensive?
It starts with training, equipping our soldiers to operate safely and effectively in a contaminated environment. They need to be confident in their protective gear, understand decontamination procedures, and be able to maintain their combat effectiveness, even under those incredibly stressful conditions.
Because a CBRN attack, even a small-scale one, could bring an offensive to a grinding halt if you're not prepared.
Absolutely. And it's not just about protecting our forces, it's also about minimizing collateral damage. We have a responsibility to decontaminate civilians and infrastructure as quickly and effectively as possible, prevent the spread of contamination, mitigate the long-term impacts. It's a huge responsibility.
So a complex challenge with no easy solutions.
That's right. But the Army is continually adapting and evolving its doctrine, training, and equipment to counter the evolving threats on the modern battlefield.
And speaking of evolving threats, we can't forget about the cyber domain, which has become increasingly integrated into, well, every aspect of modern warfare.
Absolutely. Cyber warfare isn't some futuristic concept. It's a reality of the 21st century battlefield, and it can significantly impact an offensive operation.
So we're not just talking about, hackers trying to steal secrets or disrupt communications.
No. Cyber operations can target and disable enemy weapon systems now, disrupt their command and control networks, even influence the perceptions and behaviors of entire populations. It's a whole new dimension of warfare, and it's constantly evolving.
So how does the Army's offensive doctrine address this new reality, this integration of cyber operations into, I guess you could say, traditional military thinking?
It emphasizes cyber awareness at all levels. From the newest recruit to the highest levels of command, every soldier needs to understand the potential impact of cyber attacks and how to mitigate those risks.
So it's about building a culture of cybersecurity, not just relying on a few tech wizards to handle it.
Right. But it also recognizes the need for specialized cyber units that can conduct both offensive and defensive cyber operations.
So these are our cyber warriors,
Yeah.
the digital front line, going on the offensive to disrupt enemy networks, degrade their ability to wage war.
That's precisely right. They play a crucial role in ensuring we maintain cyber superiority on the battlefield.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the tactical and operational aspects of offensive operations, but there are also those moments when the bullets stop flying, the objective is taken. What happens then?
That's where transitions come into play. A successful offensive isn't just about attacking nonstop. Sometimes it's about knowing when to shift gears. Maybe that's transitioning to a defensive posture or pivoting to stability operations.
Because winning the peace can be just as important and difficult as winning the battle.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Knowing when to shift gears, from offense to defense or even to stability operations, that's a fascinating concept. It's like you said, sometimes knowing when to hold back to consolidate your gains can be just as important as knowing when to attack.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that a military offensive is only one piece of a much larger puzzle.
So it's not just about kicking down the door, it's about what you do once you're inside.
Exactly. Securing the building, so to speak. And that requires a different skill set, a different mindset. You're shifting from a posture of overwhelming force to one of establishing security, building relationships, creating the conditions for long-term stability.
And that can be a tough transition, I imagine, especially for soldiers who are trained and equipped for high-intensity combat.
Absolutely. It requires specialized training, cultural awareness, and a deep understanding of the political and social dynamics at play.
So we're not just asking soldiers to be warriors, but also diplomats and peacekeepers.
In a way, yes. They need to be able to transition seamlessly from clearing a building to engaging with community leaders, from disarming an IED to rebuilding infrastructure.
It sounds like the human element of warfare, that understanding of the people, of the terrain, becomes even more critical in those stability operations.
Without a doubt, you can't just roll in with tanks and artillery and expect to win hearts and minds. You need to understand the local culture, the grievances, the aspirations of the people you're trying to help.
Building trust, not just projecting power.
Exactly. And that takes time, patience, and a genuine commitment to helping those whose lives have been upended by conflict.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and tackle those listener questions you pulled out. They're a great way to bring all this back to real-world examples and see these concepts in action.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so first up, what are some real-world examples where maintaining tempo was absolutely critical to the success of an offensive operation? I mean, we talk about tempo as this abstract concept, but what does it actually look like on the battlefield?
Well, one classic example is the German Blitzkrieg during World War II. Their entire strategy was built around speed, surprise, and relentless offensive action.
They would just keep hitting, wouldn't they? Didn't give their opponents a chance to catch their breath.
Exactly. They'd punch through enemy lines with tanks and mechanized infantry, bypass strong points, and keep driving deep into the enemy's rear. It was like they were playing chess while their opponents were still trying to figure out how to move the pawns.
That had to be demoralizing for the defenders.
It absolutely was. The psychological impact of that kind of relentless assault, of seeing your defenses crumbling before you can even react, it can't be overstated.
So tempo isn't just about speed. It's about the psychological pressure it puts on the enemy, that feeling of being constantly overwhelmed.
Precisely. And it can lead to a quicker, more decisive victory, as we saw with the U.S. Army's Thunder Run into Baghdad during the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
That was a textbook example of a rapid, decisive operation.
Absolutely. They faced some resistance, but they just kept pushing day and night, maintaining that momentum, and ultimately seized the capital within days.
It's like that old saying, if you're not moving forward, you're falling behind. But on the battlefield, falling behind can have much more serious consequences.
Couldn't agree more. Now, for our next listener question, how have advancements in technology, particularly in communications and intelligence gathering, changed the way the Army approaches offensive operations? And that's a huge question because the impact of technology has been nothing short of revolutionary.
It has. I mean, we've gone from using carrier pigeons and smoke signals to having real-time data feeds, drones providing constant overwatch, and the ability to share information instantaneously across the entire battle space. It's incredible when you think about it.
It really is. Commanders today have a level of situational awareness that their predecessors could only have dreamed of.
It's like the difference between navigating with a compass and a map and having a GPS system that shows you not just where you are, but also where the enemy is, where your own troops are, even the best route to your objective.
Exactly. And that kind of real-time information allows for faster, more informed decision-making. Commanders can adapt their plans on the fly, exploit fleeting opportunities, and stay one step ahead of the enemy.
So technology has definitely tilted the battlefield in favor of the offense. But it's not without its challenges, right? I mean, we can assume that our adversaries have access to similar technologies, so it's not like we have a monopoly on information dominance.
That's right. The playing field has leveled in many ways. We can't afford to be complacent or assume that our technology will always give us the edge. We have to be smarter, more adaptable, and always looking for ways to outmaneuver and outthink our opponents.
It's a technological arms race, and it's only going to get more complex and more consequential.
Absolutely. And that leads perfectly into our final listener question, which focuses on a topic that's as relevant today as it's ever been. What are some of the ethical dilemmas that commanders need to grapple with when they're planning and executing offensive operations?
Because even in the chaos of combat, we're still bound by our values and the laws of war.
Exactly. And one of the most significant ethical challenges, and this has been a concern since the dawn of warfare, is the issue of civilian casualties. How do you prosecute a military offensive against an enemy that's often embedded within civilian populations, sometimes even using civilians as human shields, without causing unintended harm to innocent people?
It's a question that keeps commanders up at night. There's no easy answer, no magic formula that guarantees zero civilian casualties.
You're right. But ADP 390 stresses the importance of proportionality, of using only the amount of force necessary to achieve the military objective, and minimizing collateral damage as much as possible.
So it's about making those tough calls, weighing the risks and benefits of every action, and always erring on the side of protecting innocent lives.
Exactly. And that requires careful planning, accurate intelligence, and a deep understanding of the potential consequences of our actions.
It's about being willing to hold back if necessary, even if it means sacrificing a tactical advantage.
Absolutely. Because a victory that comes at the cost of innocent lives is a hollow victory indeed.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the offense as laid out in ADP 390, Chapter 3. We've covered a lot of ground today. From those 4 fundamental types of offensive operations to all the critical planning considerations that can make or break a mission. We talked about the impact of technology, the enduring importance of logistics, and some of those heavy ethical dilemmas that come with waging war in the 21st century.
It's been a great conversation. Hopefully, our listeners have a deeper appreciation for the complexities of modern warfare.
Me too. And for our listeners, remember, this is just a starting point. There's a wealth of knowledge to be gained from diving into ADP 390 and other military doctrines.
Exactly. The more we understand about how our military thinks and operates, the better prepared we'll be as a nation, both to support our troops and to engage in informed discussions about the use of military power.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, stay safe.